Hey, what's up everybody? This is Ryan with Escotech, and it's no secret you can take a Dell Optiplex and upgrade it and make it into a great gaming PC. I picked up this Dell Optiplex 7020 off everybody's favorite auction site for $73, final price. The downside is it's only got a Core i3. I'm going to upgrade the CPU, but I'm limited by a 65 watt TDP CPU cooler. This video is going to cover upgrading from the stock cooler to a tower cooler and be able to get past the 65 watt TDP limit that came with the Core i3. I'm going to upgrade to an 80 watt Xeon processor, and we're going to take the cooler from this to this. Stick around and see how. This is a quick look at the last two Dell Optiplex designs. On the left is an Optiplex 7020 that uses 4th gen Intel Haswell CPUs. The models in this lineup are the Dell Optiplex 3020, 7020, and 9020. This Optiplex 7040 uses the current design, but these can be a little cost prohibitive if you're looking to do a budget build. So for the time being, I'd actually recommend sticking with the design on the left. Even though the one on the right uses a little bit newer technology, there's not that much of a performance upgrade, and the cost again is just too high. There are also more models to choose from, and I'll give you a quick rundown here. Starting with the 4th generation Haswell Intel CPUs are the Optiplex 3020, 7020, and 9020. Next we have the Ivy Bridge based 3rd generation Optiplex 3010, 7010, and 9010. And finally the 2nd generation Sandy Bridge Optiplex 390, 790, and 990. I want to mention quickly that this system is going to be featured in an upcoming video where I do a build off between an XPS 8700 and an Optiplex 7020. Be sure to subscribe if you want to check that out. Let's take another look inside at that CPU cooler. I'm going to upgrade the i3 that came with this system to a Xeon E3-1271 V3. I know that the Xeon processors can be kind of convoluted, but that's basically the Xeon sibling to the i7 4790. For laughs, I went ahead and put the i3 stock cooler on the Xeon and started at Prem 95, and temps immediately jumped into the 90s. To solve this problem, I'm going to be using this Cooler Master TX3, which is basically the little brother of the Hyper 212 Evo, which is the legendary cooler that's been made for Cooler Master for over a decade now. I picked this cooler up secondhand, and it's no longer in production, so I'm going to go ahead and link to a couple of these in the description. Basically, the case doesn't have quite enough room for 120mm, but any cooler with a 92mm fan should work. Cooler Master currently makes a Hyper T2 compact CPU cooler, 92mm fan. Arctic makes a Freezer 7X compact cooler, and Intermax also makes ones, which is out of stock right now, but it's usually pretty easily available for around $25. So let's get back inside the case, and I'm going to show two methods on how you can mount a tower cooler to a Dell Optiplex motherboard. This should work on any of the Optiplexes with this same design, and the method I used actually didn't involve removing the motherboard, but I'm going to go ahead and take it out just so I can show you the backplate that comes on these systems. I'm going to slow it down for a second just to show that the screws are in a standard ATX row alignment, 3 rows of 8 screws total. And now that we've got our motherboard out, we can take a closer look at the Cooler Master TX3 that I'm using. You can see that it has the Intel type push clips on here. So I'm going to go ahead and try to use these. This isn't the method I ended up going with, but I'm going to cover it just in case it might work with another one of the coolers that I listed. I've already got the Xeon installed, but I'm going to go ahead and take the old cooler back off, and we'll take a look at the backplate on the motherboard to see what we're looking at. Dell does use a proprietary backplate, but it does have some easy things that line up. The holes do line up with the standard 1150 socket, which is definitely going to make it easier to mount our new cooler. There are 4 metric M3 screws mounts on the cooler in the holes, and there are 3 screws that hold on the motherboard socket right in the middle. And they're all connected in this custom Dell backplate. Here are your 4 screws that go through the mounting holes, and then these 3 are standard. They're actually a 632 screw. So I'm going to take out these 3 screws to take the backplate off, and then I'll put nuts on the back of those just to hold the socket in place, and we'll take a look at trying to do the push pins through the motherboard. Now, I definitely would recommend taking the CPU out of the socket before you did this, but I went ahead and just undid the screw that holds the spring down, and it didn't cause any issues, but it'd definitely be better to have the CPU out of the way. So I'll just lift the socket cover and get access to the other 2 screws that are hidden underneath the cover. And after I've got these 3 screws out, I will take the backplate out completely so you can take a better look at it. I'll go ahead and get the CPU socket cover out of the way here, and then I'll just slide the metal backplate that Dell uses for its CPU cooler mounting out of the back. And I'll go ahead and just slide the Dell backplate out of the back of the board, and you can see that it's just basically a pretty standard metal backplate, but if your cooler does have a custom one, you might have to use the nuts on the back to keep the CPU socket down. So a note on my fan choice. The Cooler Master CPU cooler comes with a standard 4-pin header, but I'm going to go ahead and take that off because I don't want to mess with the Dell fan air. So what I've done is actually sourced another 92mm Dell fan that's got the custom Dell connector. And you can see that everything lines up. I just have to take the clips off the Cooler Master fan. There's 4 rubber bumpers with a screw underneath each one, and then I can just transfer these clips onto my Dell fan. And these are just standard fan screws that are underneath the clips on the side from the Cooler Master cooler, so don't have to do anything special here. One other note on the fan, I realized that this Dell fan, the 92mm one that I sourced, is a case fan, so it probably doesn't have the best static pressure, but we're going to have another fan pretty close for exhaust behind the cooler, so I think we'll get a little bit of a push-pull effect from both of them that'll help get some air through the cooler. So now I just have to reverse the process and put the screw and the rubber bumper on these fan brackets, and the clips will snap right onto the side of the tower. And now our cooler is ready to go onto our Dell motherboard. After putting on a bead of thermal paste, I'll go ahead and put the new cooler back onto the CPU. And I will connect my Dell fan to the proprietary Dell fan header, which again will keep us from getting the fan errors on boot or having to rewire a fan. And then I'll push the clips down. I'll try to do the best I can going diagonally and getting even pressure on the CPU socket to spread the paste out nicely. These Intel pins push through okay, but I do think the holes on the Dell motherboard are slightly bigger than a standard Intel board. You know, these held okay again, but it's not really a method I wanted to use. And again, these clips, they work pretty well, but only when the cooler is new. After they've been put on and taken off a couple times, they just don't hold as tightly as they should. With this being a second-hand cooler, it's obviously been installed and removed a couple times during its life. I was able to get all 4 pins to grab, but like I said, I didn't end up going with this method just because I wasn't confident in the mounting and how tight it would hold if the computer was ever moved or jostled. So let's scrap this idea and go ahead and move on to option 2. I'm actually going to go back to the stock cooler and take these retention clips off so I can slide these screws out. The clips just turn one direction and pop out pretty easily. What I want is actually the spring that's on the cooler. So I'm going to attach this with a screw through this spring and then into the board, but I want to use the spring to even out the pressure and try to get our CPU cooler installed as securely as possible. So I went ahead and put the stock backplate on with the Dell screws. I have 4 M3 by 20 millimeter screws that I'm going to use with the spring and then also an M3 washer. Just like this, I'll take this screw, put it on the spring, and then put the washer down below. And I've taken the push pins off of the cooler. They just had a clip that popped out and they slid right off. So those 4 are off, and I'm going to go ahead and use this method to install them on the board instead. And I've got new thermal paste installed already. I'm going to go ahead and get these started. And once I've got them started, I will go ahead and mount them starting with 2 diagonal screws. It really doesn't matter which one you start with. As long as you go diagonally, you'll get your best spread of your thermal paste. I did end up tightening these screws down until the spring was almost completely compressed. And now we can plug in our fan again to the fan header and go ahead and snap the Dell fan back on. And now our cooler is nice and secure and ready to go back into the computer. And more good news, since option 2 is the one I actually went with, it doesn't even require removing the motherboard from the case. And now we'll go ahead and reinstall the motherboard into the case. And now that I've got the motherboard reinstalled, I'm going to go ahead and fire up the computer and we can see what we can get for temps. Again, static pressure isn't great from this fan, but the rear fan should help pull some air through too, so I don't have any concerns there. In fact, I am counting on a little bit of a push-pull effect to make sure we keep our CPU nice and cool. So back over to Prime 95, I went ahead and launched it and ran it for just over an hour, and our CPU got to about 60 degrees. 3 of the 4 cores are actually lower 50 degrees, but Core 0 gets hotter on this CPU, and I noticed that with the stock cooler on too. It's just how the CPU is, I think. Without delidding it, that's not going to change. So that's it for this video. That's how you upgrade a CPU cooler in a Dell Optiplex 7020, and it should apply to any model with this design. This PC is also going to be in an upcoming video. I'm going to do a build-off between an Optiplex 7020 and a Dell Studio XPS 8700. Be sure to subscribe if you want to check that video out, and thanks for watching.